So our next speaker is Steph Yin. They are a journalist and community organizer who works at the intersection of science, health, technology, and social justice. They are working with the Sound Mind Project, a nonprofit in Philadelphia dedicated to inclusive psychedelic healing and medicine. Thanks so much for joining us, Steph. We really appreciate you coming on, and welcome to Psyched.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. All right, so my name is Steph, or Fei Yin. I'm based in Philadelphia, which is occupied Lenni Lenape land. And I'll be talking today about the whitewashing and erasure of psychedelic and plant medicine traditions, and some of the ways that Black and Indigenous communities are continuing to practice and develop those traditions today. Let me share my screen. All right, can you see my screen?
Yep, you're good.
All right, I'm actually gonna pull up, see if the slides work. Never mind, I'll use the PDF, okay. Okay, so, you know, right now, as we speak, the country is rising up to protest the anti-Black racism that permeates every facet of our society. And the psychedelics movement is part of that as well. And I guess I'll start by admitting I was a bit hesitant to speak at this conference, knowing that, you know, it's organized by a venture capital group, because I think the intense interest and investment in psychedelics right now is part of the whitewashing and the erasure of psychedelic traditions. But I also really appreciate that you are here, open and willing to learn about this topic, that you invited me. And I think that being willing to learn is the most important way for this movement to proceed. So thank you for that. My other caveat is that I'm not speaking as an expert or authority on this topic. I'm a journalist who did a story exploring the things that I'll be talking about today. So I will be speaking from a place of just sharing what I learned from Black and Indigenous folks who were willing to talk with me. If you want to learn more about this topic, I encourage you to seek out materials and stories from Black and Indigenous people. They're definitely out there, or pay Black and Indigenous people to speak at your events. And lastly, I'm just hopping onto this conference, so apologies if I'm being redundant with any of the other sessions. The plan is for me to talk a bit, and then if we have time, I'd like to play you an interview clip that I produced. The interview is with Sandor Iron Rope, who is a leader in the Native American Church. He lives in South Dakota, and he talks a bit about peyote in the interview. So to start, I'm sure, as many of you know, a lot of the psychedelics that people are interested in these days have roots in Africa, Latin America, the Pacific Islands. Psilocybin is a Mazatec plant medicine from Mexico. Ayahuasca is used in ceremonies in the Andes and Amazon. Iboga or ibogaine is used in Bwiti, a religion practiced in Central and Western Africa. Kava is a Polynesian tradition. Peyote is an American Indian tradition. You know, so basically for a long, long time, these cultures have known about the healing properties of hallucinogens and plant medicines, and Western medicine is now starting to catch up. As we know, institutional medicine has a lot of power in this world. Clinical trials set the terms for what types of symptoms qualify for treatment, how treatments are delivered, who has access, what's covered by insurance, etc. So far, a lot of the psychedelic clinical trials that have been done have been done in ways that are not exclusive. A study from 2018 found that 82% of participants in psychedelic studies were white. And you know, that's a problem. Psychedelic medicines have tremendous healing potential for everyone, but maybe especially in communities of color, where they have a lot of potential to treat racial and intergenerational trauma related to slavery, genocide, and displacement. Yet these are, the communities that are systematically being left out of the development of Western psychedelic medicine as well. A lot of people might say, it's so hard to get drugs approved, let alone drugs that are stigmatized, like psychedelics. So, let's just get it through the FDA approval first and work on inclusion later. But we know that's just not the way it works. Once you introduce profit into the game, our medical system is just inherently built in a way that values profit over the inclusion of poor and oppressed folks. We've seen that time and time again, and often medicine just widens social inequities, especially when innovations are first shared. So I think to really address this problem, the psychedelic community has to really learn about, grapple with, and take action to correct its history and culture and the way that it moves forward. So first, I'm going to talk about the culture of psychedelic communities, which in the US, a lot of psychedelic communities are predominantly white or non-Black, non-Indigenous people of color. And how the culture, within these communities can make Black or Indigenous folks feel alienated and unsafe. So, oops, I'm sorry about that. This is Ife Tayo Harvey, or Ife on the left. She's one of the people I talked to for my story. When she was 4, her dad, who's pictured here with her, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. An undercover cop propositioned him to sell cocaine. And as a new immigrant working to support his family, he accepted. He served 8 years in prison and then was deported back to Jamaica. Ife told me, "This shaped my childhood experience in a way that's hard to explain because things like this aren't supposed to happen, right?" Throughout her childhood, Ife dealt with depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. She had trouble trusting people. Her dad's absence had an effect on the whole family. Ife's mom raised 7 kids as a single parent, and later one of her brothers also ended up going to prison. Ife says, when you send one person to prison, you send their family, you send their communities, and you increase the likelihood of someone else being sentenced. With parental incarceration, you often see intergenerational incarceration. When she got to college, Ife got involved in drug policy activism, and it was through that she learned about psychedelics as a therapeutic substance. At the time, she was a senior, feeling depressed and struggling to graduate, so she decided to give psychedelics a try. She took 3.5 grams of shrooms, went on a walk with a friend through the woods of Western Mass. It was autumn, so a beautiful time of year. And once the feelings of nausea and overwhelming anxiety passed, Ife felt an authentic sense of happiness. She says for the first time in over a year, she felt like she was alive again. And at that point, she had been feeling really dull, lifeless, not really motivated to live. But during her trip, she saw plants breathing, things moved and sparkled in ways she hadn't seen before. She felt spiritually connected to the earth. And she got a reset that she says she needed to be able to graduate. Shrooms have helped Ife heal and process a lot of the trauma that she and her family went through. She said, "I've been able to look at myself with compassion, look at my family with more compassion. When you're in a sober state of mind, it's harder to process heavy things sometimes because we want to run away or we want to bury our feelings. And with shrooms, you can't really do that. Shrooms kind of make you face whatever you're running away from." So that year, Ife started learning more about psychedelic research, and after she graduated, she was excited to get a job with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. But at MAPS, Ife didn't quite feel like she belonged. She was the only Black person who worked there at the time, and she says she often felt overlooked in meetings or that colleagues were palpably uncomfortable around her. And her feelings came to head during a classic psychedelic experience, a Grateful Dead show in Chicago. It was her first time taking LSD. She was having a great time at the concert. When they walk out of the venue, there are dead heads everywhere, being wild up and down Michigan Ave. But then as they get closer to Grant Park, they see a Black man being put in handcuffs. Ife said, mind you, there's all these white folks running around on drugs, selling drugs, you know, having drugs on them, doing God knows what. The one Black guy you see at the concert is, of course, getting arrested. So someone asked, you know, should we stop and watch, make sure that the cops don't mistreat this person? And her other coworkers responded, well, he probably did something, or you don't know what he did. Let's just keep moving. And to Ife, that was kind of a moment that crystallized for her that, you know, that's representative of how Black folks are seen. She said even though she had been outspoken about her family's experience with drugs and incarceration, she never really felt like her colleagues acknowledged that. Like, they didn't check if she felt safe when everyone used substances. They didn't seem aware that her risk and connection to drugs was very different from theirs. And, you know, that felt weird because the whole reason Ife got into psychedelics was because they opened her up to joy, made it easier for her to face her pain and heal. She said, it feels like you're in a twilight zone. It's very frustrating because, this is Ife's quote, I believe that psychedelics can be healing and do amazing things for our world, but we have to be very intentional and thoughtful about how to do that. So eventually Ife left MAPS. She now works for a nonprofit called the Drug Policy Alliance, and she co-founded a group called the People of Color Psychedelics Collective. She wanted to create a space that is open and safe for people of color. Here she is at Empyrean, which was a conference put on by her collective. So, you know, right now, psychedelics are gaining a lot of traction in mainstream medicine. Researchers say we're in a psychedelic renaissance. But the big names and faces behind psychedelics, the people leading the research, the therapists doing the therapy, they're mostly white. And that's reflected in who's participating in the research trials. There's a reason why the mainstream psychedelic movement is not very diverse. Elijah Watson is a Black journalist who's written about what he calls the whitewashing of psychedelics. I also talked to him for my story, and here's an article he's written. Elijah says, you know, psychedelics originated in communities of color. Indigenous groups have used them as medicine and sacrament for thousands of years. In some cases, those traditions are alive. In other cases, they were banned or destroyed through colonization. In the 1950s, a white man named Robert Gordon Wasson went to Mexico, and he participated in a Mazatec mushroom ritual led by a medicine woman named Maria Sabina. And Maria let Robert take her picture on the condition that he keep it private. But when he got back to the US, he published the picture and the name of her community in a Life magazine article called Seeking the Magic Mushroom. That article sparked an interest in psychedelics that caught fire within the hippie movement. So you saw it emerging within countercultural music during the time with subgenres like psychedelic rock. And after the article came out, Maria's community was bombarded by white hippies who wanted to hallucinate on shrooms. Local police blamed her, and people ended up ostracizing her and burning her house down. Here's a quote from her. I realized the young people with long hair didn't need me to eat the little things. Kids ate them anywhere and anytime, and they didn't respect our customs. Meanwhile, you have figures like Ken Kesey and Timothy Leary taking on the mantle of psychedelics. And during this time, psychiatrists and medical researchers started looking into psychedelics to treat mental health. Not all of this research was above board or, for that matter, ethical. Many folks are probably familiar with MK Ultra, Project Bluebird, Project Artichoke. These are the names of top secret CIA programs in which the government used LSD, mescaline, and other psychedelics to manipulate people's mental states. The CIA also backed open research, such as the work of Harris Isbell in Lexington, Kentucky in the 50s and 60s. Isbell did experiments on incarcerated Black men, often with a history of drug addiction. He wanted to test how much LSD someone could tolerate and for how long. In some instances, he gave people LSD doses for 77 days in a row. At the time, his results were published in respectable journals. Today, his work would be considered coercive and abusive. He had subjects sign extremely simple consent forms and often motivated them by payment in the form of heroin. Sarah Reed is a Black therapist who grew up in Kentucky, and she's talked to people about the lasting legacy of these experiments. She told me that even today, if you go to these communities, they're still very suspicious of research and psychedelics. By the 70s, in reaction to the growing anti-war and Black Power movements, Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, and research into psychedelics shuttered practically overnight, and drugs became an excuse to search people's homes and cars and put them in prison. In the 80s, you had the war on crack, and ongoing to today, Black and brown people are still disproportionately arrested and targeted for drug charges. Despite roughly equal usage rates, Black people are 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis than white people. So Elijah Watson, the journalist, he told me, white people have continued to use psychedelics and have safe spaces to do so, like on college campuses. But Black people have a lot of reasons to stay away from psychedelics. He said, "My livelihood is already in jeopardy, even just by smoking some weed. We also see how police officers tend to treat people of color with mental illness. It's like we're going to shoot first and ask questions later. If I'm going to partake in the substance that may make someone think I have a mental illness and I see how cops already treat them, what's to say they're going to treat me any differently?" So to recap, we have psychedelics getting co-opted by white hippies, history of psychedelic research abuse on Black folks in Kentucky and elsewhere, war on drugs that's made people of color apprehensive about altering their state of consciousness. All that leads us up to today. So right now, MAPS is in phase 3 trials for MDMA assisted therapy. That's the last phase before FDA approval. And in this phase, MAPS has, gotten more serious about diversity and inclusion. And a few years ago, the org reached out to Monica Williams, a Black psychologist. This is Monica. She has spent her career addressing mental health disparities, and she's worked with many people who are traumatized from experiences of racism, stigma, and discrimination. So I talked to Monica about how psychedelics in particular can really help treat racial and intergenerational trauma in communities of color. She said, "We know that people in communities of color may have a lot of additional trauma beyond the usual suspects. So beyond assault and combat, things like cultural traumas due to genocide, slavery, immigration, refugee trauma." So when someone experiences trauma, it shatters their trust in the world, their feelings of safety, it causes them to be perpetually on the lookout for danger. And Monica says, if you look at experiences of racism and discrimination, you really see the same thing happening. You have people that are continually assaulted by, it could be large, major discriminatory experiences, or it could be a lot of small experiences that are coming unpredictably and causing anxiety and distress. And eventually the person starts to fear for their own safety. Often when folks try to talk about their experiences, it's dismissed. So they're kind of holding on to their experiences and carrying it around with them. And through that process, someone can start to develop PTSD symptoms as a result of racism and discrimination. So Monica says, you know, there's a general lack of therapists of color or even white therapists who are trained to think about these things. She says often it's not on clinicians' radar. They're not thinking about the fact that maybe being strip searched by a law enforcement person felt like a sexual assault, or someone getting threatened at work, maybe that landed on them like a death threat. You know, there's also intergenerational trauma, which we know gets passed down biologically through changes in how genes get expressed. With Black folks who've been in the US for generations, there's a whole legacy of slavery and Jim Crow laws and hate and violence. So Monica believes MDMA has a lot of potential to treat this PTSD and pain. She says, you know, the treatments we have for PTSD now are not that great. The medications sort of numb people's emotions, and the therapies can be effective, but very difficult. So, you know, prolonged exposure, for instance, requires people to recount their traumas in great detail, and often people don't feel able to do that. With MDMA and other psychedelics, you know, Monica sees people move through their traumas with less pain and fear. They're making new connections in their brains. And, you know, she says it's a beautiful process that she wouldn't necessarily say is true of traditional therapy. And Ife, from the beginning of our story, her experience of having more compassion for herself and others is very common too. So Monica says people are often able to forgive themselves. What keeps people stuck in PTSD is they blame themselves for the traumas that have happened to them. So you do see big shifts in the ways people think, and a lot of it seems to be connected to love, and that just sort of helps to melt away the trauma. So for all of its potential, there are still concerns that this therapy, MDMA or psychedelic-assisted therapy, will be hard to access once it's approved. It's a 12-week course and requires 2 therapists for protection, so it will be expensive, and there is still a general lack of therapists of color. So MAPS told me, you know, it's working on convincing insurance companies that this approach is cheaper than traditional PTSD therapies, which can often take much longer to work. And last summer, Monica and MAPS put on a cultural trauma workshop specifically for therapists who work with communities of color. Here's a picture from that workshop. The woman in the center of the circle is Belinda Ariaco, a Native American spiritual practitioner who helped facilitate sessions there. I spoke to Aisha Muhammad, a Philadelphia-based therapist who attended that training. She has spent much of her career working with sex workers, drug users, people who don't have housing, and she says this therapy has tremendous potential for folks who, you know, struggle to make regular appointments or come into sessions. This idea that you could address long-standing deep traumas in 3 to 5 month window is really life-changing and transformative. So Aisha is part of a team in Philly that is opening a MDMA-assisted psychotherapy clinic or psychedelic therapy clinic called the Sound Mind Center, which I also work with this group. And the clinic will offer sliding scale treatment, and there is a Black community organizer on staff who will work to raise awareness and build trust with communities that have been affected by the war on drugs. Here is Sound Mind's organizer, Ayeli Katoria, on the left, leading a breakout discussion at the cultural trauma workshop organized by MAPS. And folks in Philly also hope that the city's community health agencies, which offer free or low-cost therapy to people with Medicaid, will also hire practitioners trained in psychedelic-assisted therapy. Melody Hayes is another practitioner of color who attended the MAPS training in Kentucky. I spoke with her as well. So here she is, second from the right, and you see Monica at the podium as well. And Melody's based in San Francisco. She plans to open an inclusive psychedelic therapy center in the Bay Area called Ceremony Health. And she and I talked about the power of psychedelics to heal traumas from the past. But importantly, she didn't want the convo to end there. She also talked to me about the potential for Black, Indigenous, and other oppressed communities to build connection and pleasure and create more expansive futures through psychedelics. She said, psychedelics are the first medicine we have that is a way to experience liberation. The medicine is in how we live in community and connection with one another. She says, with psychedelics, you can experience more peace. And what are you going to build with that peace? They say that we create from what we know. And if what you know is pain and trauma, you will pass forward pain and trauma. And if what you know is peace and joy, you will create peace and joy. So that's it for my, the part I want to talk about. If there's time, I can share a little bit of a clip with Sandor Iron Rope. It's pretty short. Is there time for me to do that?
Yep, Steph, that's completely fine. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. I might need some help with the audio. I know there's 2 buttons I need to press. Let me see.
So it's under share screen when you click the share screen button in your Zoom window.
Okay. Let me go to...
So you might have to stop sharing and then start sharing again.
Okay, got it.
And so yeah, when you click the share screen button, it'll give you, when you're choosing the screen of which screen you want to share, at the very bottom, there's 2 check boxes that you can check.
Awesome, cool, okay. So, okay, this was for, this is for the podcast
by Steph Yin.
The podcast that I used to work for, and we did an episode on psychedelic therapy, and this is an excerpt, I believe. Let me know if you can hear it.
We may be in a psychedelic renaissance, but
Can folks hear that?
Yep, you're good.
Using psychedelics as medicine or therapy is not new. Many indigenous cultures have long used psychedelics to address mental health issues or questions of existence. One group keeping that tradition alive is the Native American Church. They use a type of cactus called peyote as a sacrament.
It is a medicine. It's a way of life. It is part of our ancestors. It's the flesh of God. It's part of me. I am of the medicine.
That's Sandor Iron Rope. He lives in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and he's been part of the Native American Church his whole life.
I'm a Lakota from the Oglala Sioux tribe.
Sandra says members of the church use peyote in ceremonies. It's thought the spirit communicates through the peyote to bring healing. Right now, the federal government only allows members of the Native American Church to use peyote for their religion. But in the last year, it's been decriminalized in Oakland and Denver. In part, advocates say to make research easier. But what does that mean for Native people?
Did they inquire about the indigenous perspective on how this would affect us, the indigenous communities who rely on these plant-based medicines?
Sandra says when you use psychedelics in a therapist's office, something is lost, and he's wary of where all of this is headed. Maybe pharmaceutical companies will try to isolate peyote's useful compounds, put it in a pill.
For indigenous people, when you engage in this medicine here, there's a spiritual component that you're calling upon, and there's the elements that you're utilizing. And if you are using it and just extracting what you want to commercialize it for medical purposes, you're missing something, and you will always be missing something.
Sanders says for now, peyote should just be left alone for future generations of his community.
We have been dealing with take, broken treaties. What are you giving back? This peyote medicine, it's one of our last sacraments that we have, one of our last medicines. If you really respect something, sometimes you just have to leave it alone.
That's Sandor Iron Rope. He is a member of the Native American Church.
All right. I think that is it for me. I don't know if there's time to take questions. I can take a few, or we can go to the next speaker.
Definitely. Yeah, let's, if anyone has questions, please feel free to type them in. I'll ask one of my own, and then we'll move on shortly after. Would love to know, so I had a conversation with the folks at Atai probably a month or two ago, and basically there was this question asked of how, there are these VCs, there are these capitalist institutions that are popping up in this space. Let's say that you have, $1 million. Let's just start there. What are your thoughts on, how do you distribute that million? What do you spend it on? What are the best uses of that capital to actually create impact to address some of the issues that you're speaking about?
Yeah, I mean, first off, again, I just want to iterate that, I'm not an authority on this, and I don't know if I have the authority to offer solutions, but one thing that I have heard people like Ife say is that, the psychedelic movement could really be in better solidarity with fighting the war on drugs, and just seeing all of that as a cohesive landscape and ecosystem. So really being in solidarity with the work that's being done to address and repair the harmful impacts of the war on drugs, and maybe even have some kind of model of reparations that comes from that. So that's one thing, is kind of not just seeing these medicines and different substances in silos, but recognizing that there is this double standard that in our country, and kind of lending some of the power and people power of the psychedelic movements to these adjacent movements to, demand that folks who've been incarcerated for drug crimes be released, or reparations, have some kind of model for profit to go to communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. There's also one question, I'm going to mispronounce this, but it's asking, what do you think about Oklevueha Native American Church?
I don't know much about them. I know that there are a lot of different Native American churches, and there is some sort of infighting or questions of authenticity, but I don't think that I'm positioned to speak on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Steph. We really appreciate your time. We hope you stick around the conference and check out some other talks, and we'll definitely be talking with you offline soon as well. Thanks for trusting us and speaking on behalf of all of these important issues.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.